Conclusion: The Dawn of Everything. This book began with an appeal to ask better questions. We started out by observing that to inquire after the origins of inequality necessarily means creating a myth, a file from grace, a technological transposition of the first chapters of the book of Genesis, which, in most contemporary versions, takes the form of a mythical narrative stripped of any prospect of redemption. In these accounts, the best we humans can hope for is some modest tinkering with our inherently squalid condition and hopefully dramatization to prevent any looming absolute disaster. The only other theory on offer to that has been assumed that there were no origins of inequality because humans are naturally somewhat thuggish creatures and our beginnings were a miserable, violent affair in which progress our civilization, driven forward largely by our own selfish and competitive nature, was itself redemptive. This view is extremely popular among billionaires but holds little appeal to anyone else, including scientists who are keenly aware that it isn't in accord with the facts. It, it's hardly surprising, perhaps, that most people feel a spontaneous affinity with the tragic version of the story, and not just because its scriptural roots. The more rosy, optimistic a narrative, whereby the progress of Western civilization inevitably makes everyone happier, wealthier, and more secure, was has at least one obvious disadvantage. It fails to explain why that civilization did not simply spread of its own accord. That is, why European powers should have been obliged to spend the last 500 or so years aiming guns at people's heads in order to force them to adopt it. Also, if being in a savage state was so inherently miserable, so why so many of those who were Westerners, given an informed choice, were so eager to defect to it at the earliest opportunity? During the 19th century heyday of European imperialism, everyone seemed more keenly aware of this, while we remember that age as one of the navigates in the inevitable march of progress. Liberal Turgot-style progress was actually never really the dominant narrative in Victorian social theory, let alone political thought. In fact, European statesmen, European statesmen and intellectuals of the time were just as likely to observe with the dangers of decadence and disintegration. Many were offered racists who held that most humans are not capable of progress, and therefore look forward to their physical extermination. Even those who did not share such views tended to feel that Enlightenment schemes for informing the human civilization had been catastrophically naive. Social theory, as we know it today, emerged largely from the ranks of such reactionary thinkers who, looking back over their shoulders at the turbulent consequences of the French Revolution, were less concerned with the disasters being visited on peoples overseas than ongoing misery in public unrest at home. As a result, the social sciences were conceived and organized around two questions. One, what had gone wrong with the project of enlightenment, with the unity of scientific and moral progress, and with schemes of the improvement of human society? And two, why is it that well-meaning attempts to fix society's problems so often ended up making things even worse? Why these conservative thinkers ask, did it prove so difficult for Enlightenment revolutionaries to put their ideas into practice? Why couldn't we just imagine a more rational social order and then legislate it into existence? Why did the passion for liberty equality, and fraternity ended up producing the terror. There must surely be some underlying reasons. If nothing else, their preoccupations help to explain the continued relevance of of an of an otherwise not particularly successful 18th century Swiss musician named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Those primarily concerned with the first question saw him as the first to ask it in a quintessentially modern way. Those mainly concerned with the second were able to represent him as the ultimate clueless plain, a simple-minded revolutionary who felt that the established order, being irrational, could simply be brushed aside. Many had also personally responsible for the guillotine. By contrast, few nowadays read the traditionalists of the 19th century, but they're actually important since it is they, not the Enlightenment philosophers, but who are really responsible for modern social theory. It's long been reorganized most that almost all the great issues of modern social society, science, tradition, solidarity, authority, status, alienation, and the sacred were first raised in the works of men like the theocratic Vicomte de Bonald, the monarchist Comte de Maistre, or the weak politician and philosopher Edmund Burke, as examples of the kind of stable social realities which they felt that Enlightenment thinkers, and Rousseau in particular, had refused to take seriously, with the insisted disastrous results. This 19th century debates between radicals and reactionaries never really ended. They keep resurfacing in different forms. Nowadays, for instance, those on the right are more likely to see themselves as defenders of Enlightenment values, and those on the left is at most ardent critics. But over the course of the argument, all parties have come to agree on one key point, that there was indeed something called the Enlightenment, that it marked a fundamental break in human history, and that the American and French revolutions were in some sense the result of this rupture. The Enlightenment is seen as introducing a possibility that had simply not existed before, of self-conscious projects of reshaping society in accord with some rational ideal, that is, of genuine revolutionary politics. Obviously, insurrections and visionary movements had existed before the 18th century. No one could deny that. But such pre-Enlightenment social movements could now largely be dismissed as so many examples of people insisting of a return to certain ancient ways that they had often just made up, as claiming to act on a vision from God or the local equivalent. Pre-Enlightenment societies also this argument goes where traditional societies founded on community, status, authority, and the sacred. There were societies in which human beings did not ultimately act from themselves, individually or collectively. Rather, they were slaves of custom, what based against of inexorable social forces which they projected onto the cosmos of the form of gods and just those of other supernatural powers. Supposedly, only modern post-enlightenment people had the capacity to self-consciously intervene in history and change its course. On this, everyone suddenly seemed to agree, no matter how virulently they might disagree about whether it was a good idea to do so. All this, all this might seem a bit of caricature, and only a minority of authors were willing to state matters quite so bluntly. Yet, most modern thinkers have clearly found it bizarre to attribute self-conscious social projects of historical designs to people of earlier epochs. Generally, such non-modern folk were considered to simply minded, not having achieved social complexity, or to be living in a kind of mystical dream world, or at best were thought to be simply adapting themselves to the environment at at an appropriate level of technology. Anthropology, it must be confessed, did not play a stellar role here. For much of the 20th century, anthropologists tended to describe the associates they studied in historical terms as living in a kind of eternal path, in the eternal present. Some of this was an effect of the colonial situation under which much ethnographic research was carried out. The British Empire, for instance, maintained a system of indirect rule in various parts of Africa, India, and the Middle East, where local institutions like royal courts, earth shrines, associations of elders, men's houses of the like were maintained in place. Indeed, fixed by legislation, major political change, forming a political party, say, leading a prophetic movement, was in turn entirely illegal, and anyone who tried to do such things was likely to be put in prison. This obviously made it easier to describe the people anthropologists studied as having a way of life that was timeless and unchanging. Since historical events are by definition unpredictable, it seems more scientific to study those phenomena one could in fact predict that the things that kept happening over and over in roughly the same way in a Senegalese or Burmese village. This might mean describing the daily route, seasonal cycles, rites of passage, patterns of dynastic succession, or the growing and splitting of villages, always emphasizing how the same structure ultimately endured. Anthropologists wrote this way because they considered themselves scientists, structural functionalists in the jargon of the day. In doing so, they made it much easier for those reading the descriptions to imagine that the people being studied were quite the opposite of scientists, that they were trapped in a mythological universe where nothing changed and very little really happened. When Mircea Eliade, the great Romanian historian of religion, proposed that the, traditional societies live in cyclical time, innocent of history, he was simply drawing the obvious conclusion. As a matter of fact, he went even further. In traditional societies, according to Eliade, everything important has already happened. All the great founding gestures go back to mythic times, the Ilo tempore, the dawn of everything, when animals could talk or turn into humans, sky and earth were not yet spirited, and while it was possible to create genuinely new things, marriage, or cooking, or war, people living in this mental world, he felt, saw their own actions as simply repeating the creative gestures of gods and ancestors in less powerful ways, or as invoking primordial powers through ritual. According to Eliade, historical events thus tended to mesh into archetypes. If anyone in what he considered a traditional society does do something remarkable, establishes or destroys a city, creates a unique piece of music, the deed will eventually end up being attributed to some mythic figure anyway. The alternative motion that history is actually going somewhere, the last days, judgment, redemption, is what Eliade refers to as in linear time, in which historical events take on significance in relation to the future, not just the past. And this linear sense of time, Eliade Eliot insisted, was a relatively recent innovation in human thought, one with catastrophic social and physiological consequences. In his view, embracing the notion that events unfold in cumulative sequences, as opposed to recapitulating some deeper pattern, rendered us less able to weather the vicissitudes of war, injustice, and misfortune, plunging us instead into an age of unprecedented anxiety and ultimately nihilism. The political implications of this position were, to say the least, unsettling. Eliot himself had been close to the fascist Iron God in his student days, and his basic argument was that the terror of history, as he sometimes called it, was introduced by Judaism and the Old Testament, which he saw as paving the way for the further disasters of Enlightenment thought. Being Jewish, the authors of the present book don't particularly appreciate the suggestion that we are somehow to blame for everything that went wrong in history. Still, for present purposes, what's startling is that anyone even took this sort of argument seriously. Imagine we tried applying Eliot's distinction between historical and traditional societies to full scope of the human past. On the sort of scale we've been covering in the preceding chapters. Would this not have to mean that most of history's great discoveries, for example, the first weaving of fabrics, or the first navigations of the Pacific Ocean, or the invention of ethnology, were made by people who didn't believe in discovery or in history? This seems unlikely. The only alternative would be to argue that most more human societies only became traditional more recently. Perhaps they each eventually found a state of equilibrium, settled into it, and all came up with a set ideological framework to justify the, the newfound condition, which would which would mean there actually was some kind of previous ilo tempore or time of creation, when all humans were capable of thinking and acting in the kind of highly creative ways we now consider quintessentially, quintessentially, quintessentially modern. One of their major achievements apparently being to find a way of abolishing most future prospect of innovation. Both positions are self-evidently quite absurd. Why are we entertaining such ideas? Why does it seem so odd, even counterintuitive, to imagine people of the remote past as making their own history, even if not under conditions of their own choosing? Part of the answer no doubt lies in how we have come to define science itself, and social science in particular. Social science has been largely a study of the ways in which human beings are not free, the way that our actions and understandings might be said to be determined by force outside our control. Any account which appears to show human beings collectively shaping their own destiny or even expressing freedom for its own sake will likely to written off as illusory, awaiting real scientific explanation, or, if none forthcoming, why do people dance? As outside the scope of social theory entirely. This is one reason why most big histories place such a strong focus on technology, dividing, up the, dividing up the human past according to the primary material from which tools and weapons were made: Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, or as describing it as a series of revolutionary breakthroughs: agricultural revolution, urban revolution, industrial revolution. They will assume they, they then assume that the technologies themselves largely determine the shape that human societies will take for centuries to come, or at least until the next abrupt of an unexpected breakthrough comes along to change everything again. Now, we are hardly about to deny that. technologies plays technologies play an important role in shaping society. Obviously, technologies are important. Each new invention opens up social possibilities that had not existed before. At the same time, it's very easy to overstate the importance of new technologies in setting the overall direction of social change. To take an obvious example, the fact that Teotihuacanos or Tlaxcalteca employed stone tools to build and maintain their cities, while the inhabitants of Mohenjo-daro or Knossos used metal, seems to have made surprisingly little reference to those cities' internal organization or even size. Nor does our evidence support the notion that major innovations always occur in sudden, revolutionary bursts, transforming everything in their wake. This, as you'll recall, was one of the main points of the image from the two chapters we devoted to the origins of farming. Nobody, of course, claims that the new beginnings of agriculture were anything quite like, say, the invention of the steam-powered loom or the electric light bulb. We can fairly certain there was no Neolithic equivalent of Edmund Cartwright or Thomas Edison who came up who came up with the conceptual breakthrough that set everything in motion. Still, it often seems difficult for contemporary writers to resist the idea that some sort of similarly dramatic break with the past must have occurred. In fact, as we've seen, what actually took place was nothing like that. Instead of some male genius realizing his solitary vision, innovation in Neolithic societies was based on a collective body of knowledge accumulated over centuries, largely by women, in an endless series of apparently humble but in fact enormously significant discoveries. Many of those Neolithic discoveries had the cumulative effect of reshaping where everyday life every bit as profoundly as the automatic loom or light bulb. Every time we sit down to breakfast, we are likely to be benefiting from a dozen such prehistoric inventions. Who was the first person to figure out that you could make bread rise to addition of those microorganisms we call yeast? We we have no idea, but we can almost certain she was a woman and would most likely not be considered white as if she tried to immigrate to a European country today. And we definitely know her achievement continues to enrich the lives of billions of people. What we also know is that such discoveries were, again, based on centuries of accumulated knowledge and experimentation. Recall how the basic principles of agriculture were known long before anyone applied them systematically, and that the results of such experiments were often preserved and transmitted through ritual, games, and forms of play, or even more, perhaps at the point where ritual, games, and play set into each other. Garden of Adonis are fitting, are a fitting symbol here. Knowledge about the nutritious prosperities and God cycles of what would later become staple crops feeding vast populations. Wheat, rice, corn was initially maintained through ritual play farming of exactly this sort. Nor was this pattern of discovery limited to crops. Ceramics were first invented long before the Neolithic to make figurines, miniature models of animals and other subjects, and only later cooking and storage vessels. Mining is first attested as a way of obtaining minerals to be used as pigments, with the extraction of metals for industrial use coming only much later. Mesoamerican societies never employed wheel transport, but we know they were familiar with spokes, wheels, and axles, since they made toy versions of them for children. Greek scientists famously came up with the principles with the principle of the steam engine, but only employed it to make temple doors that appear to open of their own accord or similar theoretical illusions. Chinese scientists, equally famously, first employed in gunpowder for fireworks. For most of history, then, the zone of ritual play constituted both a scientific laboratory and, for any given society, a repertory of knowledge and techniques which might or might not be applied to pragmatic problems. Recall, for example, the little old man of the Osage and how they combine research and speculation on the principles of nature with the management and periodic reform of their constitutional order. How they saw these as ultimately the same project and kept careful oral records of their deliberations. Did the Neolithic towns of Satel did the Neolithic town of Satel or Triple J mega-sized house similar colleges of little old women? We cannot know of for certain, but it strikes us as quite likely, given the state rhythms of social and technical innovation that we observe in each case and the attention to female themes in their art and ritual. We are trying to frame more interesting questions to ask of history that might be one. Is there a positive correlation between what is usually called gender equality, which might better be termed simply women's freedom, and the degree of innovation in a given society? Choosing to describe history the other way round as a series of rapid technological revolutions, each followed by long periods when we were prisoners of our own creations, has consequences. Ultimately, it is a way of representing our species as decidedly less thoughtful, less creative, less free than we actually turn out to have been. It means not describing history as a continual series of new ideas and innovations, technical and otherwise, during which different communities made collective decisions about which technologies they saw fit to apply to everyday purposes, and which to keep confined to the mode of experimentation or ritual play. What is true of technological creativity is, of course, even more true of social creativity. On one of the most striking patterns we discovered while researching this book, indeed, one of the patterns that felt most like a genuine breakthrough to us, wa- was how, time and again in human history, that zone of ritual play has also acted as a site of social experimentation, even in some ways as an encyclopedia of social possibilities. We are not the first to suggest this. In the mid-20th century, a British anthropologist named A. M. Hogarth proposed that monarchy and institutions of government were originally derived from rituals designed to channel powers of life from the cosmos into human society. He even suggested at one point that the first kings must have been dead kings, and that individuals so honored only really became sacred rulers at their funerals. Hogarth was considered an oddball by his fellow anthropologists and never managed to secure a permanent job at a major university. Many accused him of being unscientific, just engaging in idle speculation. Ironically, as we've seen, it is the results of contemporary archaeological science that now oblige us to start taking his speculations seriously, to the astonishment of many. But much as Hogarth predicted, the Upper Paleolithic really has produced evidence of grand burials, carefully staged for individuals who indeed seem to have attained spectacular riches and honors, largely in death. The principle doesn't just apply to monarchy or aristocracy, but to other institutions as well. We have made the case that private property first appears as a concept in sacred contexts, as to police, as to police functions and powers of command, along with in later times a whole panoply of formal democratic procedures like election and sortition, which were eventually deployed to limit such powers. Here, here is where things get complicated. To say that for most of human history, the ritual served as a kind of compendium of social possibilities, as it did in the European Middle Ages. For instance, when hierarchical pageants alternated with rambunctious carnivals, thus doesn't really do the matter justice. This because festivals are already seen as extraordinary, somewhat unreal, or at the very least as departures of the everyday's order, whereas, in fact, the evidence we have from Paleolithic times onwards suggests that many, perhaps even most, people did not merely imagine or enact different social orders at different times of year, but actually live in them for extended period of time. The contrast with our present situation could not be more stark. Nowadays, most of us find it increasingly difficult even to picture what an alternative economy or social order would be like. Our distant ancestors seem, by contrast, to have not regularly back and forth between them. If something did not go terribly wrong in human history, it makes the current of state of the world, it's hard to deny something did, that perhaps it began to go wrong precisely when people started losing that freedom to imagine and enact other forms of social existence to such a degree that some now feel this particular type of freedom hardly even existed or was barely exercised. For the greater part of human history, even those few anthropologists such as Pierre Clastre and Christopher Baum, who argued who argued that humans were always able to imagine alternative social possibilities, conclude rather godly that for roughly 95% of our species history, those same humans required in horror from all possible social worlds but one, the small-scale society of equals. Only our only dreams were nightmares, terrible visions of hierarchy, domination, and state. In fact, as we've seen, this is clearly not the case. The example of eastern woodland societies in North America, explored in our last chapter, suggests a more useful way to frame the problem. We might ask why. For example, it proved possible for their ancestors to turn their backs on the legacy of Cahokia, with, with its overweening lords and priests, and to recognize themselves into free republics. Yet, when the French interlocutors effectively tried to follow suit and rid themselves of their own ancient hierarchies, the result, the result seemed so disastrous. No doubt there are quite a number of reasons, but for us, the key point to remember is that we are not talking here about freedom as an abstract ideal or formal principle, as in liberty, equality, and fraternity. Over the course of these chapters, we have instead talked about basic forms of social liberty, which one might uh, actually put into practice. 1. The freedom to move away or to relocate from our surroundings The freedom to ignore or disobey commands is served by others. The freedom to shape entirely new social realities or shift back and forth between different ones. What we can now see is that the first two freedoms, to relocate and to disobey commands, often acted as a kind of scaffolding for the third, more creative one. Let us clarify some of the ways in which this propping up of the third freedom actually worked. As long as the first two freedoms were taken for granted, as they were in many North American societies where Europeans first encountered them, the only kings that, had, that could exist were always, in the last resort, play kings. If they overstepped the line, their erstwhile subjects could always ignore them or move someplace else. The same would go for any other hierarchy of offices or system of authority. Similarly, a police force that operated for once 3 months of the year and whose membership rotated annually was in a certain sense a play police force, which makes it slightly less bizarre than that their members were sometimes recruited directly from the ranks of ritual clouds. It's clear that something about human societies really has changed here, and quite profoundly. The three basic freedoms have gradually receded to the point where a majority of people living today can barely comprehend what it might be like to live in a social order based on them. How did it happen? How did we get stuck? And just how stuck are we really? There is no way out of the imagined order, writes Yuval Noah Harari in his book Sapiens. When we break down our prison walls and run towards freedom, he goes on, we are in fact running into the most spacious exercise yard of a bigger prison. As we saw in our first chapter, he is not alone in reaching this conclusion. Most people who write history on a grand scale seem to have decided that as a species we are well and truly stuck, and there is really no escape from the institutional cage we've made for ourselves. Harari, once again, echoing Rousseau, seems to have captured the prevailing mood. We'll come back to this point, but for now we want to think a bit further about this first question. How did it happen? To some degree, this must remain a matter for speculation. Asking the right questions may eventually sharpen our understanding, but for now the material at our disposal, especially of especially for the early phases of the process, is still too sparse and ambiguous to provide definitive answers. The most we can offer are some preliminary suggestions or points of departure based on the arguments presented in this book, and perhaps we can also begin to see more clearly where others since the time of Rousseau have been going wrong. One important factor would seem to be the gradual diffusion of human societies into what are sometimes referred to as culture areas. That is, the process by which neighboring groups began dividing themselves against each other and typically exaggerating their differences. Identity came to be seen as a value in itself, setting in motion process of cultural schismogenesis, as we saw in the case of Californian foragers and their aristocratic neighbors on the northwest coast. Such acts of cultural refusal could be could be self-conscious acts of political contestation, making the boundary in this case between societies where intergroup warfare competitive feasting, and household bondage were rejected, as in those parts of Aboriginal California closest to the northwest coast, and where they were accepted, even celebrated as quintessential features of social life. Archaeologists, taking a longer view, see a proliferation of such regional culture areas, especially from the end of the last age on, but are often at a loss to explain why they emerge on or what constitutes a boundary between them. Still, this appears to have been a epochal development. Recall, for example, how post-Ice Age hunter-gatherers, especially in coastal or woodland regions, were enjoying something of a golden age. There appear to have been all sorts of local experiments reflected in a proliferation of opulent burials and monumental architecture, the social functions of which often remain enigmatic, from shell-built amphitheaters along the Gulf of Mexico to the great storehouses of Sanai Maruyama in Yobon, Japan, or so-called giants churches of the Bothnian Sea. It is among such Mesolithic populations that we often find that, that we often find not just the multiplication of distinct cultural areas, but also the first clear archaeological indications of communities divided into permanent ranks, sometimes accompanied by interpersonal violence, even warfare. In some cases, this may this may already have meant the stratification of households into aristocrats, commoners, and serfs. In others, quite different forms of hierarchy may have taken root. Some appear to have become effectively fixed in place. The role of warfare warrants further discussion here, because violence is often the route by which forms of play take on more permanent features. For example, the kingdom the kingdoms of the Natchez of Europe might have been largely theoretical affairs. The rulers are unable to issue orders that would be obeyed even a mile or two away, but if someone was arbitrarily killed as part of a theatrical display, that person remained definitively dead even after the performance was over. It's an almost absurdly obvious point to make, but it matters. Plague kings, plague kings cease to be plague kings precisely when they start killing people, which perhaps also helps to explain the excesses of ritually sanctioned violence that so often ensued during transitions from one state to the other. The same is true of warfare. As Lance Carey points out, two communities might choose to resolve a dispute by partaking in a contest, and often they do, but the ultimate difference between war or contest of enduring, as she puts it, and almost other kinds of contest is that anyone killed or disfigured in war so remain disfigured in ours remains so even after the contest ends. Still, we must be cautious. While human beings have always been capable of physical attacking one another, and it's difficult to find examples of societies where no one ever attacks anyone else under any circumstances. There is no actual reason to assume that war has always existed. Technically, war refers not just to organized violence, but to a kind of contest between two clearly demarcated sides. As Raymond Kelly, as Raymond Kelly had adroitly pointed out, it's based on a logical principle that's by no means natural or self-evident. Why states that major violence involves two teams, and any member of one team treats all members of the other as equal targets. Kelly called this Kelly calls this the principle of social substitu- substitu- substitutability. That is, If a Hatfield kills a McCoy, then the McCoy the, and the and the McCoys retail it, it doesn't have to be against the actual murderer, and the Hatfield is fair game. In the same way, there is a war between France and Germany, and a French soldier can kill any German soldier, and vice versa. The murder of entire populations is simply taking the same logic one step further. There is nothing particularly primordial about such arrangements. Certainly, there is no reason to believe they are in any sense hardwired into the human psyche. One, on the contrary, it almost invariably necessary to employ some combination of ritual, drugs, and psychological techniques to convince people, even adolescent males, to kill and injure each other in such systematic yet indiscriminate ways. It would seem that for most of human history, no one saw much reason to do such things, or if they did, it was rare. Systematic studies of the Paleolithic record over little evidence of warfare in this specific sense. Moreover, since war was always something of a game, it's not entirely surprising that it has manifested itself in sometimes more theatrical and sometimes more deadly variations. Ethnography provides plenty of examples of what could best be described as play war, either with non-deadly weapons or, more often, battles involving thousands on each side, where the number of casualties after a day's fighting amount to perhaps two or three. Even in Homeric-style warfare, most participants were basically there as an audience, while individual heroes taunted, jeered, and occasionally threw javelins or shot arrows at one another, or engaged in duels. At the other extreme, as we've seen, there is an increasing amount of archaeological evidence for the Reich massacres, such as those that took place among Neolithic village dwellers in Central Europe after the end of the last ice age. What strikes us? What strikes us is just uneven such evidence is. Periods of intense intergroup violence alternate with periods of peace, often lasting centuries, in which there is little or no evidence for destructive conflict in any kind. War did not become a constant of human life after the adoption of farming. Indeed, long periods of time exist in which it appears to have been successfully abolished. Yet it had a stubborn tendency to reappear, if only many generations later. At this point, another new question comes into focus. Was there a relationship between external warfare and the internal loss of freedoms that opened the way first to systems of ranking and then later on to large-scale systems of domination, like those we discuss in the later chapters of this book? The first dynastic kingdoms and empires, such as those of the Maya, Shang, or Inca. And if so, how direct was this correlation? One thing we've learned is that it's a mistake to begin answering such questions by assuming that these ancient polities were simply archaic versions of our modern states. The state, the state as we know it today, results from a distinct combination of elements: sovereignty, bureaucracy, and a competitive political field, which have entirely separate origins. In our thought experiment of two chapters ago, we saw how those elements map directly, directly onto basic forms of social power, which can cooperate at any scale of human interaction, from their family of house or from their family or household all the way up to the Roman Empire or the super kingdom of Tawantinsuyu. Sovereignty, bureaucracy, and politics are magnifications of elementary types of domination, grounded respectively in the use of violence, knowledge, and charisma. Ancient political systems, especially those such as the Olmec or Kevin de Huantar, that elude definition in terms of symptoms and states can often be understood better in terms of how they develop one excess of social power to an extraordinary degree, e.g., charismatic political contests and spectacles in the Olmec case, or control of extraordinary knowledge of Calvin. Theirs, these are what we term first-order regimes. When two axes when two axes of power were developed and formalized into a single system of domination, we can begin to talk of second-order regimes. The architects of Egypt's Old Kingdom, for example, armed the principle of sovereignty with a bureaucracy and managed to extend it across a large territory. By contrast, the rulers of ancient Mesopotamian city-states made no direct claims to sovereignty, which from them resided probably to inherit when, when they engaged in wars over land or irrigation systems. It was only a secondary agent of the gods. Instead, they combined charismatic competition with a highly developed administrative order. The classic Maya were different again, confining administrative activities largely to the monitoring of cosmic affairs while basing their earthly power on the potent fusion of sovereignty and interdynastic politics. Insofar as they insofar as this and the other politics commonly regarded as early states, South China, for instance, really share any common features. They seems really s- they seem to lie in altogether different areas, which brings us back to the question of welfare and the loss of freedoms within society. All of them deployed spectacular violence at the pinnacle of the system, whether that violence was conceived as a direct extension of royal sovereignty or was carried out at the behest of divinities, and all to some degree modeled the centers of power, the court of palace, on the organization of patriarchal households. Is this merely a conceit? On reflection, the same combination of features can be found in most later kingdoms or empires, such as the Han, Aztec, or Roman. In each case, there was a close connection between the patriarchal household and military might. But why exactly should why exactly should this be the case? The question has proved difficult to answer in all but superficial terms, partly because our own intellectual traditions oblige us to use what is, in effect, imperial language to do so, and the language already implies an explanation, even a justification, for much of what we are really trying to account for here. That is why, in the course of this book, we sometimes felt the need to develop our own, more neutral, dare we say scientific, list of, bas- list of baseline human freedoms and forms of domination, because existing debates almost invariably begin with terms derived from Roman law, and for a number of reasons that is problematic. The Roman law conception of natural freedom is essentially based on the power of the individual, by implication, a male head of household, to dispose of his property as he sees fit. In Roman law, property isn't even necessarily a right, since rights are negotiated with others and involve mutual obligations. It's simply power, the blunt reality that someone in possession of a thing can do anything he wants with it, except that which is limited by force or law. This formulation has some peculiarities that jurists have struggled with ever since, as it implies freedom is essentially a state of primordial exception to the legal order. It also implies that property is not a set of understandings between people over who gets to use or look after things, but rather a relation between a person and an object characterized by absolute power. What does it mean to say one has the natural right to do anything one wants with a hand grenade? Say, except those things one isn't allowed to do. Who would come up with such an odd formulation? An answer is suggested by the West Indian sociologist Orlando Patterson, who points out that Roman law conceptions of property and hence of freedom essentially trace back to slow law, to slave law. The reason it is possible to imagine property as a relationship of domination between a person and a thing. The thing is because in Roman law the power of the master rendered the slave a thing, res, meaning an object, not a person with social rights or legal obligations to anyone else. Property law, in turn, was largely about the complicated situations that might arise as a result. It is important to recall for a moment who these Roman jurists actually were that laid down the basis for our current legal order, our theories of justice, the language of contract and torts, the distinction of public and private and so forth. While they spend their public lives making sober judgments as magistrates, they live their private lives in households where they not only had near total authority over their wives, children, and other dependents, but also had all their needs taken care by dozens, perhaps hundreds of slaves. Slaves trimmed their hair, carried their plows, fed their pets, repaired their sandals, played music at their dinner parties, and instructed their children in history and maths. At the same time, in terms of legal theory, these slaves were classified as captive foreigners who, conquered in battle, had forfeited rights of any kind. As a result, the Roman Jews was free to rape, torture, mutilate, or kill any of them at any time in any way he had a mind to, without the matter being considered anything other than a private affair. Only under the reign of Tiberius were any restrictions imposed on a on what a master could do to a slave, and what this meant was simply the permission from a local magistrate had to be obtained before a slave could be ripped apart by wild animals. Other forms of execution could still be imposed at the owner's whim. On the one hand, freedom and liberty were private affairs. On the other, private private life was marked by the absolute power of the patriarch over conquered people who were considered his private property. The fact that most Roman slaves were not prisoners of war in the literal sense doesn't really make much difference here. What's important is that the legal status was defined in those terms. What is both striking and revealing for our present purposes is how in Roman jurisprudence the logic of war, which dictates which dictates that enemies are intentionable, and if they surrender they could either be killed or rendered socially dead, sold as commodities, and therefore the potential for arbitrary violence was inserted into the most intimate sphere of, of social relations, including the relations of the care including the relations of care that made domestic life possible. Thinking back to examples like the eruptory societies of Amazonia or the process by which dynastic power took root in ancient Egypt, we can begin to see how important that particular nexus violence and care has been. Rome took the entanglement to new extremes, and its legacy still shapes our basic concepts of social structure. Our very word family shares a root with the Latin famulus, meaning house slaves, via familia, which originally referred to everyone under the domestic authority of a single paterfamilias or male head of household. Domus, the Latin word for household, to in turn gives us not only domestic and domesticated but dominium, which was the technical term for the emperor's sovereignty, as well as citizens' power over private property. Though that, through that, we arrive at literally familiar notions of what it means to be dominant, to possess dominion, and to dominate. Let us follow this line of thought a little further. We've seen how in various parts of the world, direct evidence of warfare and massacres, including the carrying off of captives, can be detected long before the appearance of kingdoms or empires, much harder to ascertain. For such early periods of history is what happened to captive enemies, where the killed, incorporated, or left suspended somewhere in between. As we learn from various Amerindian cases, things may not always be entirely clear cut. There were often multiple possibilities. It's instructive, it's in this context, to return one last time to the case of the wounded in age of Kandiarong, since this was one society that seemed determined to avoid ambiguity in such matters. In certain ways, Wendat and Iroquoian societies in general around that time were extraordinary warlike. There appear to have been bloody rivalries broke out in many northern parts of the eastern woodlands even before European settlers began supplying indigenous factions with muskets, resulting in the Beaver Wars. The early Jesuits were often appealed by what they saw, but they also noted that the ostensible reasons for wars were entirely different from those they were used to, or when that wars were, in fact, mourning wars carried out to assuage the grief felt by close relatives of someone who had been killed. Typically, a war party would strike against traditional enemies, bringing back a few scalps and a small number of prisoners. Captive women and children would be adopted. The fate of men was largely up to the mourners, particularly the women, and appeared to outsiders at least to be entirely arbitrary. And if the mourners felt it appropriate or male captive might be might be given a name or even the name of the original victim. The captive enemy would henceforth become that other person, and after a few years real period be treated as a full member of society. If for any reason that if, if, for, if for any reason that did not happen, however, he suffered a very little fate. Or for a male warrior taken prisoner, the only alternative to full adoption into Wenda society was excruciating death by torture. Jesuits found the details shocking and fascinating. What they observed, sometimes at the first hand, was a slow, public, and highly tactical use of violence. True, they considered that when the threat of captives was no more cruel than the kind directed against enemies of the state back home in France. What seems to have really appealed them, however, was not so much the weeping, boiling, grinding, cutting up, even in some cases cooking and eating of the enemy, so much the fact that almost everyone in the wounded village or town took part, even women and children. The suffering might go on for days, with the victim periodically resuscitated only to endure further ordeals, and it was very much a communal affair. The violence seems all the more extraordinary once we recall how the same when the societies refused to spank children, directly punish thieves and murders, or take any measure against their own members that smack of arbitrary authority. In virtually all other areas of social life, they were renowned for solving their problems through calm and reasoned debate. Now, it would be easy to make an argument that represent aggression must be vented in one way or another, so that urges of communal torture are simply the necessary flip side of a non-violent community, and some contemporary scholars to make this point, but it doesn't really work. In fact, Iroquois seems to be precisely one of those regions of North America where violence flared up only during certain specific historical periods and then largely disappeared in others. In what archaeologists term the Middle Woodland Phase, for instance, between 100 BC and 500 and 8500, corresponding roughly to the heyday of Hop World civilization, there seems to have been general peace. Later on, signs of endemic warfare reappear clearly at some points in their in their history. People living in this region found effective ways to ensure that vendettas didn't escalate into a spiral of retaliation of actual warfare. The House de Nocini story of the Great Law of the Sea of the Peace seems to be about precisely such a moment. At other times, the system the system broke down and the possibility of sadistic cruelty returned. When what then was the meaning of these treaties of violence? One day, to approach the question is to compare them with what was happening in Europe around the same time. As the Quebecois historian points out, when that who visited France were equally appalled by the tortures exhibited during public punishments and executions. But what struck them as most remarkable is that the French whipped Hank and put to death men from among themselves rather than external enemies. The point is telling, as in 17th century Europe, the Lage notes almost all punishment, including the death penalty, involved several physical suffering, wearing an iron collar, being whipped, having a hand cut off, or being branded. It was a ritual that manifested power in a conspicuous way. They were revealing the existence of an eternal war. Those of Orange incarnated a superior power that transcended his subjects, one that they were compelled to recognize, while the Amerindian cannibals rituals saw the desire to take over the strength and courage of their alien so as to combat him better. The European ritual revealed the existence of dissymmetry and irrevocable imbalance of power. When that punitive actions against war captives, those not taken in for adoption, require the community to become a single body unified by its capacity for violence. in France. By contrast, the people were unified as potential victims of the king's violence. But the contrast ran deeper still, as when the traveler observed of the French system, anyone guilty or innocent might end up being made a public example. Among the wounded themselves, however, violence was firmly excluded from the realm of family and household. A captive, a captive warrior might either be treated with loving care and affection, or be the object of the worst treatment imaginable. No middle ground existed. Prisoner, prisoner sacrifice was not merely about reinforcing the solitary of the group, but also proclaimed the internal sanctity of the family and the domestic realm as space of female governance, where violence, politics, and rule by command did not belong. When that households, in other words, were divided in exactly opposite terms of the Roman familia. This particular respect for society under the ancient regime uh, under the ancient regime presents a rather similar picture to Imperial Rome, at least where both are placed in the light of the winded example. In both cases, household and kingdom shared a common model of subordination. Each was made in the in the order's image, with the patriarchal family serving as a template for the absolute power of kings, and vice versa. Children were to be submissive to their parents, wives to husbands, and subjects to rulers whose authority came from God. In each case, the superior party was expected to inflict chastisement when he considered it appropriate, that is, to exercise violence with impunity. All this, moreover, was assumed to be bound up with feelings of love and affection. Ultimately, the household, the house of Bourbon monarchs, like the palace of an Egyptian pharaoh, Roman emperor, Aztec Tlatoani, or Saba Inca, was not merely a structure of domination but also of care, where a small army of courtiers labored night and day to attend to the king's every physical need and prevent him, as much as was humanly possible, from ever revealing anything but divine. In all these cases, the bond, the bonds of violence and care extended downwards as well as upwards. When we can do better than put it in words made famous by King James I of England in the True Law of Free Monarchies 1598, as the father of his fatherly duty is to care for nourishing, education, and fetus government of his children, even so is the king bound to care for all his subjects as the father's wrath and correction on any of his children that offended ought to be a fatherly chastisement seasoned with pity, so long as there is any hope of amendment in them. So out the king towards of any his leaks that went in that measure, as the father's chief joy, ought to be in procuring his children welfare, rejoicing in the well, sorrowing and pitying at the evil, was that for their safety. So out a good prince think of his people. Public torture in 17th century Europe created sharing unforgettable spectacles of pain and suffering in order to convey the message that the system in which husbands could brutally wives and parents with children was ultimately a form of love. When that torture, in the same period of history, created searing, unforgettable spectacles of pain and suffering in order to make clear that no form of physical chastisement should ever be contained inside a community or household. Violence and care in the wounded case were to be entirely separated. Seen in this light, the distinctive features of wounded prisoners start to come into focus. It seems to us that this connection, or better perhaps confusion, between care and domination is utterly critical to the larger question of how we lost the ability freely to recreate ourselves by recreating our relations with one another. It is critical. It is critical It is critical that is to understanding how we got stuck and why these days we can hardly envisage our own past or future as anything other than a transition from smaller to larger cases. In the course of writing this book, we have tried to strike a certain balance. It will be intuitive for an archaeologist and an anthropologist immersed in our subject matter to take on all the scholarly views about, say, Stonehenge, the Uru expansion, or European social organization, and explain our preference for one interpretation over another, or venture a different one. This is how the search for truth is normally conducted in the academy. But how we try to outline or refute every existing interpretation of the material we covered, that this book would have been 2 or 3 times the size and likely would have left the reader with with a sense that the authors are engaged in a constant battle with demons who were in fact 2 inches tall. So instead, we have tried to map out what we think really happened and to point out the flaws in other scholars' arguments only insofar as they seem to reflect more widespread misconceptions. Perhaps the most stubborn misconception we've been tackling has to do with scale. It doesn't seem to be received wisdom in many quarters, academic and otherwise. The structures of domination are inevitable result of populations scaling up by orders of magnitude. That is a necessary that is that the necessary correspondence exists between social and spatial hierarchies. Times and again we found ourselves confronted with writing which simply assumes that the larger and more densely populated the social group, the more complex the system needed to keep it organized. Complexity, in turn, is still often used as synonym for a hierarchy. Hierarchy, in turn, is used as a euphemism for change of command, the origins of the state, which means that as soon a large of numbers of people decided to live in one place or join a common project, they must necessarily abandon the sacred freedom to refuse orders and replace it with legal mechanisms for beating or locking up those who don't do as they're told. As we've seen, none of these assumptions are theoretically essential, and history tends out to bear them out. Carol Grumley, an anthropologist and expert on Iron Age Europe, has been pointing this out for years. Complex systems don't have to be organized top down, either in the natural or in the social world. That we tend to assume otherwise probably tells us more about ourselves than the people or phenomena that we're studying. Neither is he alone in making this point, but more often than not, such observations have fallen on deaf ears. It's probably time to start listening because exceptions are fast beginning to outnumber the rules take cities. It was once assumed that the rise of urban life marks some kind of historical turnstile, whereby everyone who passed through had to permanently surrender their basic freedoms and submit to the rule of faceless administrators, stern priests, paternalistic kings, or warrior politicians simply to avoid chaos. or cognitive overload. To view human history through such a lens today is really not all that different from taking on the mantle of a modern day King James, since the overall effect is to portray the violence and inequalities of modern society as somehow arising naturally from structures of rational management and paternalistic care, structures designed for human populations who we are asked to believe become suddenly incapable of organizing themselves once their numbers expanded above a certain threshold. Not only do such views lack a sound basis in human psychology, they are also difficult to reconcile with archaeological evidence of how cities actually began in many parts of the world. Civic experiments on a grand scale, which frequently lack the expected features of administrative hierarchy and authoritarian rule. We don't possess an adequate terminology for these early cities. To call them egalitarian, as we've seen, could mean could mean quite a number of different things. It might imply urban parliament and coordinated projects of social housing, as with some pre-Columbian centers in the Americas, or the self-organizing of or autonomous households into neighborhoods and citizens' assemblies, as with prehistoric megasites north of the Black Sea, or perhaps the introduction of some explicit notion of equality based on principles of uniformity and sameness, as in Uruk period Mesopotamia. None of this variability is surprising once we recall what preceded cities in each region. That was not, in fact, rudimentary or isolated groups, but far-flung networks of societies, spanning diverse ecologies with people, plants, animals, drugs, objects of value, songs, and ideas moving between them in endlessly intricate ways. While the individual units were demographically small, especially at certain times of year, they were typically organized into loose coalitions or confederacies. At the very least, they were simply the logical outcome of our first freedom to move away from one's home, knowing one will be received and cared for, even valued in some distant place. At, at most, they were examples of amphitheony in which some kind of formal organization was put in charge of the care and maintenance of sacred places. It seems that Marcel Mauss had a point when he argued that we should reserve the term civilization for great hospitality zones such as this. Of course, we are used to thinking of civilization as something that originates in cities, but armed with new knowledge, it seems more realistic to put things the other way round and to imagine the first cities as one of those great regional confederacies compressed into a small space. Of course, monarchy, warrior, O- Of course, monarchy, warrior aristocracies, or other forms of stratification could also take hold in urban contexts, and often did when this happened, and consequences were dramatic. Still, the mere existence of last human settlements in no way caused this phenomena, and certainly didn't make them inevitable. For the origins of the structures of domination, we must look elsewhere. Hereditary aristocracies were just as likely to exist among demographically small or modest-sized groups, such as the heroic societies of the Anatolian highlands, which took form on the margins of the first Mesopotamian cities and traded extensively with them. Insofar, we, insofar as we have evidence for the exception of monarchy as a permanent institution, it seems to lie precisely there and not in cities. In other parts of the world, Some urban populations ventured partway down the road towards monarchy, only to turn back. Such was the case of the Teotihuacan, the Valley of Mexico, where the city's population, having raised the pyramids of the sun and moon, that abandoned such aggrandizing projects and embarked instead on a prodigious program of social housing, providing multi-family apartments for its residents. Elsewhere, early cities followed the opposite trajectory, starting with neighborhood councils and popular assemblies and ending up being ruled by warlike dynasts when they had to maintain an easy coexistence with all the institutions of human governance. Something, something along with these lines took place in early dynasty Mesopotamia after the Uruk period. Here again, the convergence between systems of violence and systems of care seems critical. Sumerian temples had always organized their economic existence around the nurturing and feeding of the gods, embodied in the cult status which became surrounded by a whole industry and bureaucracy of welfare. Even more crucially, temples were charitable institutions. Widows, orphans, runaways, those exiled from their kin groups or other support networks would take refuge there. At Uruk, for example, in the temple of Inanna, protective goddess of the city, overlooking the great courtyard of the city's assembly. The first charismatic workings attach themselves to such spaces, quite literally moving in next door to the residence of the city's leading deity. In such ways, Sumerian monarchs were able to insert themselves into institutional spaces once reserved for the care of the gods and thus removed from the realm of ordinary human relationships. This makes sense because kings, as the Malagasy proverb puts it, have no relatives or their children, since they are rulers equally of all their subjects. Slaves too have no kin. They are, they are severed from all prior attachments. In either case, the only recognized social relationships such individuals possess as those based on power and domination. In structural terms, and as against almost everyone else in society, kings and slaves effectively inhabit the same ground. The difference, the difference lies in which end of the power spectrum they happen to occupy. We also know that needy individuals taken into such temples institutions were supplied with regular rations and put to work on the temple's lands and its workshops. The very first factories, or at least the very first in we are aware in history, were charitable institutions of this kind, where temple bureaucrats would supply women with wool to spin and weave, sacrifice the disposal of the product, much of it traded with upland groups, in exchange for wood, stone, and metal unavailable in the river valleys, and provide them with carefully apportioned rations. All this, all this was already too long before the appearance of kings as persons dedicated to gods. This woman must originally have had a certain dignity, even a sacred status. But already by the time of the first written documents, the situation seems to have grown more complicated. By then, some of those working in Sumerian temples were also war captives or even slaves who were similarly bereft of family support over time, and perhaps as a result, the status of widows and orphans also appears to have been downgraded until the temple institutions came to resemble something more like a Victorian poorhouse. How, we might then ask, did the degradation of women working in the temple factories affect affect the status of women more generally, if nothing else? It must have met the prospect of fleeing an abusive domestic arrangement far more daunting. Loss of the first freedom meant increasingly of the second. Loss of the second meant expressment of the third. If a woman in such a situation attempted to create a new cult, a new temple, a new vision of social relations, she would instantly be marked as a subversive, revolutionary. If she attracted followers, she might well find herself confronted by military force. All this brings into focus another question. Does this newly established nexus between external violence and internal care, between the most impersonal and the most intimate of human relations, mark the point where everything begins to get confused? Is this an example of how relations that were once flexible and negotiable ended up getting fixed in place? An example, in other words, of how we effectively got stuck. If there is a particular story we should be telling, a big question we should be asking of human history instead of the origins of social inequality is precisely this. How did we find ourselves stuck in just one form of social reality, and how did relations based on ultimately on violence and domination come to be normalized within it? Perhaps the scholar who most closely approached this question in the last century was an anthropologist and poet named Franz Steiner, who died in 1952. Steiner led a fascinating if tragic life. A brilliant polymath born to a Jewish family in Bohemia, he later lived in an Arab family in Jerusalem until expelled by the British authorities, conducted field work in the Carpathians, and was twice forced by the Nazis to flee the continent, ending his career, ironically enough, in the south of England. Most of his im- Most of his immediate family were killed at Birkenau. Legend has it that he completed 800 pages of a monumental doctoral dissertation on the comparative sociology of slavery, only to have the suitcase containing his drafts and research notes stolen on the train. He was friends with he was friends with and a romantic rival to Elias Canetti, another Jewish exile at Oxford, and a successful suitor to the novelist Iris Murdoch. Al- Although, the, Although 2 days after she accepted his proposal of marriage, Steiner died of a heart attack. He was 43. The shorter version of Steiner's doctoral work, which does survive, focuses on what he calls preservation institutions. Poignantly, given his own life story, it is a study of what happens in different cultural and historical situations to people who become unmoved, those expelled from their clans, from some depth of world, castaways, criminals, and runaways. It can be read as a historian of how refugees such as himself were first welcomed, treated as almost sacred beings, then gradually degraded and exploited again, much like the woman working in the Sumerian temple factories. In a sense, the story told by Steiner appears to be precisely about the collapse of what we would term the first basic freedom, to move away or relocate, and how this paved the way for the loss of the second freedom to disobey. It also leads us back to a point we made earlier about the progressive division of the human social universe into smaller and smaller units, beginning with the appearance of cultural areas, a fascination of ethnologists in the Central Europe tradition, in which Steiner first framed what happens, Steiner asks, when expectations that was the freedom of movement possible, the norms of hospitality and asylum, civility and shelter erode. Why does this so often appear to be a catalyst for situations where some people can exert arbitrary power over others? Steiner worked his way in careful detail through cases ranging from the Amazonian Hitoto and East African Savoie to the Tibeto-Burman Lusai. Along the journey, he suggested one possible answer to the question that had so puzzled Robert Lowy and later clusters. If stateless societies do regularly organize themselves in such a way that chiefs had no coercive power, then how did top-down forms of organization ever come into the world to begin with? You recall both Lowy and clusters were driven to the same conclusion that they must have been the product of religious revelation. Steiner provided an alternative route. Perhaps he suggested it all goes back to charity. In Amazonian societies, not only orphans but also widows, the mad, disabled or deformed, if they had no one else to look after them, were allowed to take refuge in their chief's residence, where they received a share of communal meals. To this were occasionally added war captives, especially children taken in raiding expeditions. Among the Sahwa of Lusay runaways, debtors, criminals or others needing protection had the same status as those who surrendered in battle, all because members of the chief's retinue and the younger males often worked on the role of police-like enforcers. How much power the chief actually had over his retainers? Steiner uses the Roman law potestas, which denotes among other things uh, a father's power of arbitrary command over his dependents, and their property would vary depending how easy it was for us to run away and find refuge elsewhere, or to maintain at least some ties with relatives, clans, or outsiders willing to stand up for them. How far such headsmen could be relied on to enforce the ships will also vary, but the sheer potential was important. In all such cases, the process of giving refuge did generally lead to the transformation of basic domestic arrangements, especially as the Roman were incorporated, further reinforcing the postures of fathers. It is possible to detect something of this logic in almost all historically documented royal courts, which invariably attracted those considered freaking or detached. This seems have to see, have to this seems to have been no region of the world from China to the Andes where cultural societies did not host such obviously distinctive individuals, and few monarchs did also claim to the protectors of widows and orphans. One could easily imagine something along these lines was already happening in this in certain hunter-gatherer communities during much earlier periods of history. The physically anomalous individuals recorded lavish burials in the last ice age must also have been the focus of much caring attention while alive. No doubt there are sequences of development linking such practices to later royal courts. We've got glimpses of them, as in pre-dynasty Egypt, even if we are still unable to reconstruct most of the links. Steiner may have not foregrounded the issue, but his observations are directly relevant to debates about the origins of patriarchy. Feminist anthropologists have, have long argued for a connection between external large male violence and the transformation of women's status in the home. In archaeological and historical terms, we are only just beginning to gather enough material to begin understanding how that process actually works. This research that culminated in this book began almost a decade ago. essentially as a form of play. We perceive it at first, it would be fair to say, in the spirit of mild defiance towards our more serious academic responsibilities. Mainly, we were just curious about how the new archaeological evidence that had been building up for the last 30 years might change our notions of early human history, especially the parts bound up with the best on the origins of social inequality. Before long, though, we realized that we what we were doing was potentially important because hardly anyone else in our fields seemed to be doing this work of synthesis. One, we found ourselves searching in vain for books that we assumed must exist, but it turns out simply didn't. For instance, compendia of early cities or the lack of top-down governance or accounts of how democratic decision making was conducted in Africa or the Americas, or comparisons what we've called shared societies. The literature is riddled with absences. We eventually came to realize that this reluctance to synthesize was not simply a product of reticence on the part of highly specialist scholars, although this is certainly a factor. To some degree, it was simply the lack of an appropriate language. What, for instance, does one even call a city lacking top-down structures of governance? At the moment, there is no commonly accepted term. There one called it a democracy. A republic, such was, like civilization, a society with historical baggage that most archaeologists and anthropologists instinctively recoil from them, and historians tend to limit their use to Europe. Does one then call it an egalitarian city? Probably not, since to evoke such attempt is to invite the obvious demand for proof that the city was really egalitarian, which usually means, in practice, showing that no element of structural inequality existed in any respect of its inhabitants' lives, including households and religious arrangements, since such evidence will rarely, if ever, be forthcoming. The conclusion would have to be that these are not really egalitarian cities after all. By the same logic, one may easily conclude are, there aren't really any egalitarian societies except possibility except possibly certain very small foraging bands. Many researchers in the field of evolutionary anthropology do, in fact, make precisely this argument, but ultimately the result of this kind of thinking is to lump together all non-egalitarian cities, or indeed all non-egalitarian societies, which is a little like saying there's no meaningful difference between a hippie commune and a biker gang, since neither are entirely non-violent. All this achieves at the end of the day is to leave us literally at a loss for words when confronted with certain major aspects of human history. We fall strangely mute in the face of any kind of evidence for humans doing something other than rushing headlong for their change. Sensing a sea change in the evidence of the past, we decided to approach things the other way around. What this meant, in practice, was reversing a lot of polarities. It meant teaching the language of equality and inequality, unless there was explicit evidence that ideologies of social inequality were actually present on the ground. It meant asking, for instance, what happens if we accord significance to the 5,000 years in which serial domestication did not lead to the emergence of pampered aristocracies, standing armies, or tech peonage, rather than just the 5,000 in which it did. What happens if we treat the rejection of urban life or of slavery in certain times and places as something just as significant as the emergence of those same phenomena in others? In the process, we often found ourselves surprised. We'd never have guessed, For instance, the slavery was most likely abolished multiple times in history in multiple places, and that very possibly the same is true of war. Obviously, such abolitions are rarely definitive. Still, the periods in which free or relatively free societies existed are hardly insignificant. In fact, if we look at the Eurasian Iron Age, which is effectively what we have been doing here, they represent the vast majority of human social experience. Some theories have a tendency to write about the past as if everything that happened could have been predicted beforehand. This is somewhat dishonest, since we're all aware that we actually try to predict the future, we almost invariably get it wrong, and this is just as true of social theories as anybody else. Nonetheless, it's hard to resist the temptation to write and think as if the current state of the world in the early 21st century is the inevitable outcome of the last 10,000 years of history, while in reality, of course, we have little or no idea what the world will be like even in 2075, let alone 2150. Who knows? Perhaps if our species does endure, and we one day look backwards from these as yet unknownable future aspects of the remote past that now seem like anomalies, says bureaucracies that work on community scale, cities governed by neighborhood councils, systems of government where women hold a preponderance of formal positions or forms of land management based on care based on caretaking rather than ownership or administration will seem like they are really significant breakthroughs and great stone pyramids of status more like historical curiosities. What if we were to take the approach now and look at, say, Minoan Crete or Hopewell not as random bumps on the road that leads inexorably to states and empires, but as alternative possibilities, roads not taken? After all, those things really did exist, even if our habitual ways of looking at the past seem designed to put them at the margins rather than at the center of things. Much of this book has been devoted to recalibrating those scales, to reminding us that people did actually live in those ways, often for many centuries, even millennia. In some ways, such a perspective might seem even more tragic than our standard narrative of civilization as the inevitable fall from grace. It means we could have been living under radically different conceptions of what human society is actually about. It means that mass enslavement, genocide, prison camps, even patriarchy or regimes of wage labor never had happened. But on the other hand, it also suggests that even though the possibilities for human intervention are far greater than we're inclined to think. We begin this book with a quote which refers to the Greek notion of kairos as one of those occasional moments in society's history when its frames of reference undergo a shift, a metamorphosis of the fundamental principles and symbols, when the lines between myth and history, science and magic become blurred, and therefore real change is possible. Philosophers sometimes like to speak of the event, a political revolution, a scientific discovery, an artistic masterpiece, that is, a breed which reveals aspect of reality that had previously been unimaginable, but once seen can never be unseen. If so, Kairos, the kind of time in which events are prone to happen. Societies around the world appears to be cascading towards such a point. This is particularly true of those which, since the First World War, has been having the habit of calling themselves Western. On the one hand, fundamental breakthroughs in the physical sciences, or even artistic expression no longer seem to occur with anything like the regularity people came to expect in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet at the same time, our scientific means of understanding the past, not just our species past, but that of our planet, has been advancing with dizzying speed. Scientists in 2020 are not, as readers of mid-20th century science fiction might have hoped, encountering alien civilizations in distant star systems, but they are encountering radically different forms of social under their own feet, some forgotten and newly rediscovered, others more familiar, but now understood in entirely new ways. In developing the scientific means to know our own past, we have exposed the mythical substructure of our social science. What once appeared unsellable axioms, the stable points around which our self-knowledge is organized, as scattering like mice. What is the purpose of all this new knowledge, if not to reshape our conceptions of who we are and what we might yet become? If not, in other words, rediscover the meaning of our third basic freedom, the freedom to create new and different forms of social reality. Meat in itself is not the problem here. It shouldn't be mistaken for bad or infantile science. Just as all societies have their science, all societies have their myths. Myth is the way in which human societies give structure and meaning to experience. But the larger mythic structures of history we've been deploying for the last several centuries simply don't work anymore. They're impossible to reconcile with the evidence now before our eyes and the structures and meanings they encourage authority, sovereigns, and politically disastrous. No doubt, for a while at least, very little will change. Whole fields of knowledge, not to mention university chairs and departments, scientific journals, prestigious research grants, libraries, databases, schools curricula, and the like have been designed to fit the old structures and the old questions. Max Planck once remarked that new scientific truths don't replace old ones by convincing estab- Max Planck once remarked that new scientific truths don't replace old ones by convincing established scientists that they were wrong. They do so because proponents of the older theory eventually die, and generations that follow find the new truths and theories to be familiar or fuse even. We are optimists. We like to think that it will not take that long. In fact, we have already taken a first step. We can see more clearly we can see more clearly what is going on when, for example, a study that is rigorous in every other respect begins from the unexamined assumption that there was some original form of human society that its nature was fundamentally good or evil, that the time before inequality and political awareness existed, that something happened to change all this, that civilization and complexity always come the price of human freedoms. The participatory democracy is natural in small groups but cannot possibly scale up to anything like a city or nation state. We know now that we are in the presence of myths.